at this point, we have already paid an enormous price to be where we are. So saying, well, we are giving up on these territories, on these people, and we will have protection to the rest of the country will be politically really tough. And again, very complicated to explain to people.
The Defence Secretary John Healey is seeking to forge a new leadership role in Ukraine's war with Russia in a move that could see British boots on the ground there. The Times was the only media organisation to accompany him on a trip to Kyiv just hours after the killing of a high-profile Russian general. He told our defence editor Larissa Brown that Britain needs to make the training a better fit for what the Ukrainians need. Let's speak to James Hansen, who presents Frontline, the Times radio series focusing on the conflict in Ukraine. Good morning to you, James.
Morning, Stig.
And to Kira Rudik, a Ukrainian MP who joins us from Kyiv. Morning, Kira.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
A great pleasure. James, just put this in context for us, if you may, because a lot of talk, including it would seem from Zelensky, who's in the Times today, saying that he accepts, at least for the moment, that they're not going to get back the land of Crimea and the Donbass. A lot of the context around the war is the arrival of Donald Trump, the war coming to an end, and yet John Healey wants to go out there and show that he's willing to increase the support for Ukraine, at least in the short term.
I think what's really interesting here, Stig, is that both Zelensky and John Healey are really trying to send messages that Donald Trump wants to hear. Because if you're Donald Trump, one of your grievances with the amount of support that he would see the US has had to provide to Ukraine is the idea that the Europeans haven't been doing their bit, that the Europeans haven't been doing as much as the US. Now, that isn't entirely fair because the UK in particular has been, from day one, very supportive of Ukraine and has led the way in the provision of things like main battle tanks. But it is true that as a proportion of what we provided, it is much smaller than what the US have, and the same applies to Germany and France. So if you're John Healey, talking about, look, we need a new 5-point plan and we need to ramp up our support, is the kind of thing that Donald Trump wants to hear. He's not necessarily saying that he wants to cut off all support for Ukraine. He just wants the Europeans to do more and maybe the US to do less. Equally, if you're Zelensky, you're very conscious of the fact that Donald Trump wants to initiate some kind of peace talks. And interestingly, Zelensky has sounded more open to that than Vladimir Putin has. And you've had people who are close to Donald Trump, people like General Kellogg, coming out and saying, look, if Vladimir Putin won't come around the table, we are prepared to arm Ukraine to the teeth. And Zelensky's conscious of that. So Zelensky's trying to present himself to Trump as someone who is happy to have these conversations, happy to discuss potential terms, even if it's going to be difficult to strike an agreement in the end. And you've got John Healey trying to communicate to Trump that European leaders do get it and understand they need to do more.
Yeah, the arrival of Trump is such a fascinating part of this conflict. Kira, are we entering the beginning of the end of this conflict, do you think? Because that's a tone that's being struck by some people we've been speaking to on this programme over the last month or so. Do you agree with that?
Well, you see, Donald Trump came to power with the campaign promise to end the war in just one day. And there is actually only one good way of doing that, is pressuring Vladimir Putin to pulling back his troops. Otherwise, even striking any kind of agreement, having everyone to agree to that and then executing may take years. Again, we have already been in this in 2014. We know how much Putin's word was, and we know that striking an agreement is easier than making Putin to actually act on it. And the question is, and always will be, who or what will make sure that Russia keeps their part of the bargain. Because again, we have been into that, and we have been in the ceasefire situation since 2014, and look where it got us. Russia just gathered their troops and attacked us again.
So in that context, Kira, that's a really important point, I think, for people to recognise. Is there a world in which the Russian troops withdraw, but they remain in control of Crimea and the Donbass, but there is some sort of security guarantee offered by the West? So ultimately, Ukraine joins NATO, and therefore its territory is supported by the whole NATO alliance behind it. Is that a version of events that you would consider acceptable? You don't get Donbass and Crimea back, at least in the short term, but there's some sort of security guarantee for the rest of Ukraine from the West.
Well, President Zelensky said that would be acceptable. However, I think it will be incredibly hard for him to sell it here in Ukraine.
Really?
Right now, we have like more than 80% of people, of families who have either somebody fighting at the front or lost someone at the front. And at this point, we have already paid an enormous price to be where we are. So saying, well, we are giving up on these territories, on these people, and we will have protection to the rest of the country will be politically really tough. And again, very complicated to explain to people.
Would you accept it, Kira? Would you accept it as an MP and as a Ukrainian?
I will have to look into the details because we do not believe in any security guarantees since the Budapest Memorandum, right? Yeah. So we will have to figure out what is being promised, because honestly, the main thing that we have to work on right now is to make sure that our children will not have to fight this war again. Yeah. And for that, we'll have to make difficult decisions, but we will need to look into the details because devil is always in the details, right? I
think that's a very, very fair point. James, just finally on this question, will the US, do you think, from all the conversations you have, I know you speak to many generals and former generals and people involved in NATO, is the West willing to say, all right, what happens with Donbass and Crimea may be one thing, but the rest of Ukraine is guaranteed by NATO because Ukraine's coming in and it's coming in quickly? We've heard people say that to us on our show. Is that a reality, do you think? Is that something that all people in the West would be willing to agree to?
I think this is the million-dollar question. I mean, you are hearing it, including through what John Healey's been telling the Times, a kind of realization that if we're not careful, this is heading towards some kind of big European conflict, and NATO will have to maybe physically take the fight to Russia at some point, not simply help arm Ukraine. But this is the million-dollar question. Donald Trump certainly wants to avoid that. Everyone clearly wants to avoid that. The question is, how best do you avoid it? And there is this ongoing debate as to whether you can strike some kind of deal with Vladimir Putin that could freeze the front lines, that could give some kind of security guarantee to NATO, to Ukraine, potentially membership of NATO down the line, and would that hold? Or, if you strike any kind of deal with Vladimir Putin, are you simply delaying the problem? And will he be back in 3, 4, 5 years' time? That is the debate. Is there a deal you can strike? Is there any deal you can strike with Putin that isn't simply passing the buck and deferring the problem down the line?
Which, of course, will happen.
Which,
of course, will happen with Crimea, as Kira was saying, and the devil is always in the detail. A really interesting stuff from you, James, and really important to hear from Kira there. Kira Rudik, Ukrainian MP from Kyiv, and James Hanton, who presents Frontline, the Times radio series focusing on the conflicts in Ukraine. If you're interested in this part of the world and the conflict, then just go to the Times Radio YouTube channel and look up Frontline.